What was the significance of the classical economist David Ricardo? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by my co-host, professor of economics at the Citadel, Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you again.
Well, it's good to be with you, and
Yep.
of course, always with our viewers and listeners.
Before we get started, I want to remind everybody that the fifth presenter in our online Austrian economics program is this coming Thursday, Joe Salerno, another Austrian economics star. I'm getting a lot of good feedback from people about our series here. They seem to be enjoying the informal nature of the presentation and how Austrian economics impacted the lives of these Austrian stars and changed the course of their thinking. And I know you'll join Joe Salerno, and then our wrap-up speaker will be the great Richard Ebeling next week. To register, you just go to our homepage at fff.org, go to the upcoming events, click into the conference, register. You'll get a Zoom link, and then you can participate. And yeah, you'll be able to watch it later on if you want. We're going to record it and put it on our website as we've done with all the other presentations. But it's fun to participate live because then you can ask questions during the Q&A session or during the discussion session, make comments, and so forth. All right, Richard. So last week,
Jacob, if I can interject something for a moment about Joe Salerno.
Okay.
I know that Joe Salerno is truly dedicated to Austrian economics. And the way I know this, Jacob, is if I can take 1 or 2 minutes. I first met Joe at the first Austrian Economics Conference in South Royalton, Vermont in June of 1974, 50 years ago this coming June. And then there was another Austrian Economics Conference the following year at the University of Hartford, where Dom Armentano, well-known Austrian, was teaching, and he was the host, the coordinator of it. So I arrive in Hartford, and they place us in dorm rooms because, it's the summer break. And I'm walking around campus, and I see this woman sitting on a park bench, around the quad area. And she sort of is downcast, and she's almost crying. And I'm hesitant at first, but I finally go up to her and I say, well, excuse me, I don't mean to intrude, but can I help you with anything? And she says, no, it's just, I was married yesterday. And instead of taking me on a honeymoon, my new husband has taken me here so he can attend an Austrian economics conference. And I said, what a scoundrel, how insensitive. Who was this person? Joe Salerno.
That's hilarious.
It's an absolutely true story. Absolutely true.
That's
Salerno
great.
told me that.
That's great. I hope they're still married.
Oh, they are.
That's awesome. So she was able to recover.
Absolutely. But that shows his dedication. An Austrian Economics Conference rather than a honeymoon the day after you're married.
and extreme confidence too that she's not going to leave him.
Exactly. But I just wanted to share that.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, again, Joe Salerno this coming Thursday too. At 7 p.m. Eastern time. So, Richard, last week we were going to talk about the classical economists, and it turned out to be part one because we spent the whole half hour on the foundation leading up to the classical economists. And we talked about Adam Smith, and we talked about the physiocrats. And I think it was a good foundation. In fact, it brought back memories of, I told you that when I moved to Dallas many, many years ago in the 1980s, I sought out the head of the economics department at the University of Dallas, a man named Sam Bostaff, who was an Austrian economist. And I asked him to give me a tutorial in Austrian economics. And as I detailed, he asked me for my reading list, and I showed it to him. And he said, no, let's go back to the foundation. And that's when we did a chapter by chapter study of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So that's essentially what you were doing. I mean, you were doing what Sam Bostaff said. Before you get to Austrian economics, you got to study the classical economists to understand the significance of Austrian economics. But before you can get to the classical economists, you got to study the real foundational principles of that led up to the classical economists. And again, I would recommend that people not so much read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, at least not right off the bat, but go to a history of economic thought book so that you can understand everything in perspective. And I think Mark Skousen's book is excellent, and as well as just go to the library and check out a book on history of economic thought.
Mark, this is Mark Skousen's book, The Making of Modern Economics. It's I think it's a very good quality history of economic thought book, and it would be one to start with. X actually in its 4th edition. Mark has done a very good job with it.
All right, fantastic. So then why don't we move now into the Austrian economists, Richard? Why don't you now lay? I mean, what did I say? Austrian economists. Yeah, let's now move into the classical economists. And so I will throw the baton to you and take it away and give us the synopsis of what the classical economists were all about, who were they, and so forth.
Okay, so just to reiterate where we did leave off, until about the 1700s, there really wasn't a systematic field of economics. And what I had been focusing on last week, and we ended up taking up the whole time, was the French physiocrats and the Scottish moral philosophers for the most part. They were the first ones who developed a systematic understanding of the logic of a market order, a market system, a system that is of human action, but not of human design, to quote Adam Smith's fellow Scotsman, Adam Ferguson, and the idea of the invisible hand. And so that sort of pre-classical school included such people as Francois Quinet, Turgot in France, David Hume and Adam Smith in Great Britain especially. And then you started to see what in the history of economic thought books now called the real classical school, emerging in the first decades of the 19th century. The two most prominent ones, though not the only ones, and I'll talk about a few others, in terms of Great Britain, were Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo. Thomas Malthus is well known for his essay on population. What happened is that there was this socialist named Godwin who had written a book on political justice. And he basically had followed Plato's presumption that human nature is malleable and changeable, and that if many men are greedy, avarice, possessiveness, insensitive to the needs and the betterment of others, it is due to the institutional order of private property. Private property makes us acquisitive, possessive, self-interested, selfish, greedy, and therefore antisocial. The answer, he believed, was if we change the institutions, we change the human being. Just as Plato had argued that the guardian class in his famous utopia of a future state in his book, The Republic, the guardian class, the warriors who would protect and serve the defense of the city, the imaginary perfect city state, would live in communism. They would not, and by living in communism, they would not have private property. They would not have any significant material possessions other than their personal immediate effects. They would live in common. They would share in common. There would be no marriage. They would just be what today we call like free love. If a woman gave birth to a child, I know it's shocking. Back then, they actually thought women gave birth to child. Nowadays, we don't know that for sure. It could be any gender, but back then they believed that women gave birth to children. So if a woman gave birth to a child, the child very soon after birth would be taken away and brought up in a state orphanage. The idea that there would be no sense of either the father or the mother having a self-interest in the child as opposed to all the children of the city-state. And so if you change the institutions, you change the psychology and the behavior and the motives of the individual. So Godwin believed that if you do away with private property Men will become altruistic, other-oriented. They'll be freed of possessiveness and acquisitiveness. They'll only want to do good for the society. And in one of these disappearances of self-interested motives will be the sex drive. Yes, we'll all sort of become, group eunuchs, and therefore the pressures of population will no longer be there. The concerns about food, men will work for the common good. And then this book came out, and it caused quite a stir. And then Thomas Malthus, who was a reverend, man of the cloth, took up the challenge of this and wrote this book on the essay on population. And he said there are certain that you can't change human nature, that there's an invariant human nature in our drives, our attitudes, our psychologies, our wants. And basically, he said that there's two postulates underlying the human condition. Man needs food to survive. Well, it's kind of hard to disagree with that. And second of all, the passions of the sexes for each other are the same today as they were in the past, and are likely to remain the same in the future. So in other words, you can try to change the institutions, and you could try to change men's attitudes, but people are going to want food, and they're going to desire sex. And the sex acts brings forth little people. Now, the consequence of this is that since you can't change human nature and about either needing food or the sex drive, there's always a tendency for the number of people in the society to outrun the available food supply. That just because you change the institutions doesn't mean you're going to create this utopian society of prosperity where people become altruists as opposed to self-interested. And he believed this of the technology of the time, that you can increase food production, but arithmetically. 1, 2, 3, 4. But the population has a tendency to increase exponentially, multiplicatively, because people during their prime of their life, they can participate in the sex act and generate more children than merely the two that would replace them, so that the population will tend to increase from 2 to 4 to 7 to 15 to 27 and keep going up, so that there's always this tendency for the number of people in the world to exceed the available food supply, and that therefore there's always this pressure to keep man not much above subsistence. Changing institutions is not going to create prosperity. Now, this caused a huge controversy because it seemed like there's nothing we can do about poverty. So then Malthus came out with this idea that in a second edition, that there is a third postulate, and that is man has self-control. He can control his urges. And the way he can control his urges is delay marriage until he has acquired a skill, a profession, a start in life that will enable him to support himself and his children, and then to restrain his passions in the marital relationship to minimize the number of children he has. That is, not to go beyond what his own earnable income will be able to sustain them at a decent living. So you have a passion, a need for food, a passion for the sex drive, but a will to restrain yourself, delay marriage, restrict yourself in the procreative years in the sex act, and that will enable at least a modest improvement and maintenance of a decent standard of life. But that once the passions are let go, man cannot escape from poverty. So that's in fact one of the reasons why another major English figure of the time, Thomas Carlyle, referred to economics as the dismal science. That's where the phrase comes from. Thomas Carlyle, he hated economics, or political economy was called. Oh, they're concerned with food and sex, and they think that poverty is inescapable. And what a dismal science! What a dismal science! Man can rise above that. There's truth in Godwin, even though Carlyle himself was very much of a political conservative, not a socialist. And that then resulted in a variety of new thoughts on these things. One of which was David Ricardo. Now, David Ricardo, he's an interesting character. He was born into originally a Jewish Dutch family. His father owned a brokerage house, commodity dealings, currency dealings. And young David was being groomed to be the heir apparent. In other words, to take over the family business. But the family had moved to England when David was rather young. He had basically grown up in Great Britain. And in England, he met a woman that he fell in love with. And the problem was she was a Quaker. And he came from a relatively Orthodox Jewish family. And the father and the mother were adamant that he could not marry out of the faith. But love conquers all, and he eloped with this woman. He converted to Christianity, so he was accommodative to her family, and they eloped. The consequence is that his father disowned him, and the mother refused to ever speak to him again for her entire life. So here he is. He has a new wife. He's thrown out of his father's business, but he has his ability, this knack, his acumen, this sort of innate ability of what he had learned in his father's business, and just a talent for entrepreneurship. He sets up his own commodity and currency firm, and to make a long story short, within a handful of years, he's made what for that time, right, the early 19th century, would have been a fortune in Great Britain, like a millionaire. So at a relatively young age, I guess it was in his mid or late 30s, no more than his late 30s, if I remember correctly, he retired from business to an estate in the British countryside. Now, besides his running his business very successfully, obviously, he became interested in the economic issues of the time. And his first public or wider notoriety came during England's war with Napoleon. Now, the British had been financing, as Napoleon was in France, the British had been financing a good part of the war expenditures by printing money. And there was this huge controversy. Well, why is inflation going on? Why is the pound falling, losing its value in the foreign exchange markets? Is it a scarcity of goods that are making prices rise? Is it the uncertainties of whether we're going to win the war that's making the foreign exchange rate fluctuate and be against Great Britain? Or is it printing paper money? And so Ricardo participated in this debate and wrote a famous essay called The High Price of Bullion, in which he basically argued that if prices are rising and the value of your country's currency is diminishing on the foreign exchange markets relative to other currencies, obviously, it is due to this excessive printing and issuance and circulation of paper money, which is raising this upward pressures on prices so that it becomes more attractive to buy less expensive foreign goods than your domestic goods, as Hume had argued earlier, which we talked about last week, and that therefore your currency diminishes as people are trying to import more than they're exporting, and the currency falls in value. And he developed the whole theory, but it caused quite a controversy at the time. But he got interested in these wider issues. He read Adam Smith. He had done it on a holiday. He read Adam Smith while he was on a holiday and got absorbed in all of this. And a good friend of his named James Mill, who was the father of John Stuart Mill, had said, David, you have all these ideas and you have to write it up. Oh, I can't write. I don't want to write. I don't know. Who knows how to write? But James Mill said, no, David, you have to do this. So he ends up writing this book called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, which comes out in 1817, this first edition, 1817. And this is really the foundation of classical economics. It becomes the basic core conceptual framework for all of especially British and good part of American economics for well until the end of the 19th century. So what is the basis of this? Well, Ricardo takes Adam Smith's idea that ultimately the value of goods is based upon the quantity of labor that has gone into its manufacture. So if it takes a day's labor to down a deer by a hunter, and if it takes a day to successfully trap and capture 2 beaver by a trapper, then one deer should trade for 2 beaver, representing equivalent amounts of labor expenditure. Now, of course, then what do you do with machines? Well, the value or price, the value of machine is representative of the labor input that has gone into its manufacture. So it's like stored up labor. So you have to deal with that. What determines the value of land? Well, then Ricardo develops what basically the marginal value of land. That the value of a land is based upon 2 things: the amount of labor that goes into its tillage, but its fertility. So that if you're settling a new piece of land, never cultivated before, you will pick the most fertile and richest piece of land. And let's suppose it takes, I don't know, 5 hours of labor time to successfully cultivate that and bring forth a harvest. Well, then what will be the next land you bring into cultivation? The next most fertile land. But let's suppose that takes 10 hours of labor time to cultivate. It's less fertile. You have to go further to bring irrigation for the watering of it, et cetera, et cetera. And so therefore, the marginal cost of the second piece of land will be greater than the cost of the first piece of land bought into cultivation. And that explains rent. Rent is the difference between the labor cost of bringing in the next most fertile piece of land, which is more expensive in terms of labor time, compared to the first one. And then the third one, and the third one, and the fourth one, and the fifth one, and the sixth one. So you continue to bring less cultivatable and fertile land into use, but each one involving a higher labor cost. So the rents on less on more fertile land is rising relative to the marginal more expensive piece of land. So that explains rent. You have machinery is just accumulated labor, and then just labor services in general as the amount of labor time that's gone into them. And that becomes, I'm obviously very simplifying, Jacob, at this, for our purposes, but it's just that becomes, now we know what determines wages, we know what determines the prices of commodities, and we know what determines the value of land. But given that, what Ricardo does is he draws a variety of interesting conclusions. One is that markets will assure that products are being produced at their competitively lowest cost when there's open, unrestricted competition. Price will be influenced by the labor cost that has gone into it, but don't we want to assure that we're having the minimum cost given all circumstances of the actual labor time? Competition assures that the cost prices are minimized, and therefore goods are being offered at the least expensive prices. But this is also important now that it extends to international trade. Now, what Ricardo does also is to develop what we call the theory of comparative advantage. He wasn't the first. James Mill, in his own book on political economy, talked about this several years before Ricardo, as had another British man named Colonel Robert Torrens. But the gist of it was that, well, I understand that it makes sense that if I can't produce something and that guy can, obviously, if I don't buy it from him, I don't have access to it. Well, okay, that makes sense. So that's a reason for trading with someone. He can do something I can't. So I either buy it from him or I do it without. And okay, I can understand this other point, but if it took me 5 hours to make the particular good in question, but he could do it in 2.5 hours, well, why don't I specialize in doing something for 2.5 hours that he can't do in that amount of time? And then I trade a 2.5 hour thing for his 2.5 hour thing. And we've each saved time, because it would take me otherwise 5 hours to get what he can do in 2.5, and he'd be spending 5 hours to do what I can do in 2.5. So we've each freed up 2.5 hours and gotten a desired product by specialization in trade. I understand that. So I either buy it from him or I do without it, or if I make it myself, it's more expensive than if I buy it from him. Okay, I understand that. But what if, now, in the 1950s, there was a a musical, a movie called Annie Get Your Gun, about Annie Oakley. And in the movie, there's a song that Doris Day and I forget who the male lead sing. Anything you can do, I can do better. No, you can't. Yes, I can. And so, what if you're looking at a trading partner, and what you see is that anything your trading partner can do, you can do better. I'm a better farmer than him. I can get a larger harvest out of the soil in less time and with less labor effort than him. And at the same time, I'm better at manufacturing than him. I can make textile goods in less time and less in investment of labor time than him. So I'm more productive at farming. I'm more productive at manufacturing. Why would I ever trade with this guy? So the idea is that, well, then some people will lose out on trading opportunities because other people will just produce at home. Ricardo says no. You're ignoring the fact that people may be better at many things, but they tend to be comparatively better or best at some things. And so he basically sets up this example between the British who are cultivating wheat and the Portuguese who are making wine. And he basically shows that even though Great Britain may be in general more productive at many things, it has a comparative advantage at wheat production compared to wine growing. And that is, it could grow its own wine. You could grow vineyards in Britain. But the problem is that in all relative terms, it would be more effective for Britain to specialize in what it's best at. But let me use this homely example like this. Because if I was at the chalkboard, I could do a little number example, and then every student says, oh, yeah, I see it. Suppose that it takes you 3 hours as a medical doctor, 3 hours to tend your own garden around your house, mow the yard, tend the bushes, trim the trees, 3 hours of your labor time. You could hire a professional gardener to do this. But if you hire a professional gardener to do this, what you could do in 3 hours, it takes him 4. Okay, so you obviously are more efficient at gardening yourself than the guy who's supposedly the professional gardener. Second of all, you're a trained medical doctor. You're a brain surgeon, and you're able to easily do 2 brain operations an hour. Well, how many brain operations could the gardener do? Well, Jacob, he can't do any. He can't do any. Of course, he could try to with his little tools, his gardening tools, but it was a little awkward brain surgery going on there. So both in gardening and in medical procedures, the doctor is more productive and efficient than the gardener. He can do his own gardening in less time than the professional gardener, and he can do brain surgery and the gardener cannot. Anything he can do, I can do better. So should the medical doctor do his own gardening? And the answer is no. Because what are the relative values of his services? Well, let us suppose that to do the gardening for the doctor, the gardener would charge $25 an hour. So to do the gardening in 4 hours will cost the doctor $100. But let's suppose that by freeing up 3 hours of his labor time, the doctor in that time could do 2 brain surgeries an hour, so a total of 6 brain operations, for which he would receive each one $50. So if he doesn't have to do his own gardening, he can do 6 brain surgeries and earn $300. So what should the doctor do? Do his own gardening in less time than the professional gardener? Or instead focus on his medical practice and make $300 by freeing up 3 hours of his labor time, paying the gardener $100 for doing in 4 hours what he could have done in 3 hours himself, and have a net gain of $200. So where it comparatively is his greatest market value in the use of his own time and resources? In his own gardening or not? No, it is better to hire the less efficient gardener so that he can free up his time to do what in value terms he is most valuable and productive at. And that's an important insight. It shows why people trade, whether they live on the same block, and specialize, whether they're living on the same block or in the same state or in the same country or the same continent or the same planet. And in principle, if there were people on Mars, and these people on Mars might be less efficient than anyone on Earth in a variety of activities, but in comparative terms, we people on Earth would be at a net gain by allowing those less efficient Martians to do something for us, because they would free up our time for things that are more valuable. Then it would be worth participating in global galactic trade with the Martians. It's an important insight. And it was the classical economists drew the conclusion that therefore the best policy is to allow unrestricted international trade. Let the division of labor develop in its various absolute and comparative ways, not only within the borders of the country, but between nations, internationally, globally, and all participants in this will be made better off. And as I ended my discussion last time about David Hume, his essay of the jealousy of trade, where he says, not just as a human being, but as a British subject, I pray for the prosperity of Spain and Italy and Germany, and even the great enemy, France itself, because the more prosperous they are, the more trading opportunities I will have. Well, Ricardo's argument on comparative advantage just solidified that. It reinforced it. And that became a fundamental basis upon which in the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s and for the rest of the 19th century into our time, advocates of economic liberty have made the case for free trade. It's not only a matter that people should be allowed to freely trade with whomever they want based upon the idea of individual liberty, but that from an economic point of view, by allowing unrestricted freedom of trade, the patterns and the relationships of trade will take the form in which individuals are gaining the best that they can by specializing in what they have the most efficient talents to do in comparative advantage terms. And therefore, both the strong, the efficient, are made better off, but the less efficient find a niche at the table of global trade to improve their own circumstances as well. So therefore, the gardener can make a living too. He does in 4 hours what the doctor could have done in 3, but by freeing up the doctor's time to do what the doctor is more, in value terms, more profitable and effective and efficient at, he has a place in the niche of at the table of prosperity as well. So this is an important insight. Matching this was Ricardo's views on these monetary issues. Now,
let me interrupt you for a second, just to make a couple of points here, because we're about running out of time again. So we're obviously going to have to go into part 3, or we're getting to go into part 3. But let me make a couple of points about what the point you're making. I mean, as I recall reading David Ricardo, this was called the law of comparative advantage.
Right, the law of comparative advantage.
And the example I use it from an everyday standpoint, I mean, your examples are excellent. The one I use is, since I practiced law for many, many years, was that let's assume that I have a choice of hiring a secretary, and her job is to type up all the lawsuits, the petitions, and the briefs, the appellate briefs. But the fact is that I can type these things up faster than she can. I'm better at it than she is. And so does that mean that I should say, forget the paying the secretary? I can do this and save a lot of money. I don't have to pay her a salary. I can just type up these petitions and briefs myself. Well, no, because I should spend all my time doing what I'm comparatively better off at, practicing law. I can make a lot more money devoting the entire day to practicing law, even though I'm having to pay her a salary. That on net, I'm better off than spending half my day typing up all these petitions and briefs and the other half of the day practicing law. The other thing I wanted to just point out here, Richard, is that when you were talking about this theory of value that Ricardo was set forth, I mean, that principle is found in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations,
yes,
isn't it? Isn't he?
He takes it from him.
Yeah, he's drawing on that foundation with respect to value that Smith set forth, and then also with respect to trade. I mean, the Wealth of Nations has a whole chapter on trade, yes. Right? So what we're doing is we're showing how this foundation that Smith sets forth, and to a certain extent the physiocrats that were saying, you know, let it be. Were they the ones that said laissez-faire or laissez-passer?
Yes.
Okay, let it be, let it pass, get the government out of this thing. that those ideas then find themselves into Ricardo's ideas.
Yes. So as a consequence of this is that the arguments running from Adam Smith and David Hume to Ricardo and his associates are the foundational basis upon which those who became the leaders of the free trade movement in Great Britain, the Richard Cobdens, the John Brights, for example, they dealt at a political level, that is, persuading the general public, trying to get people elected to parliament who would vote a certain way, all based upon the, quote, the theoretical arguments of the benefits of the trade, the nature of specialization and the division of labor, and comparative advantage that these earlier and classical economists had developed. In other words, it's hard to see how it would have been possible to as easily or as effectively rationalize, justify, articulate, explain, prove the benefits of doing away with all the trade restrictions on agriculture, manufacturing, etc., if there had not been the development of these ideas of just let the market alone, and there'll be a natural pattern and coordination and an efficiency, including how trade develops and why, both between individuals and nations. And that's a profound and important core element of what economics began at and has become and still is in its better, most form, from David Hume and Adam Smith to Ricardo on the benefits of trade and the freedom of trade. And then I was going to mention, I know time is a scarce resource, I'm looking at the clock myself, is that the arguments that people like David Ricardo made in the face of the experience of the paper money inflations during Britain's wars with first revolutionary and then Napoleonic France, led to the conviction that you cannot trust the government's hand on the monetary press's crank, right, turning the printing press, when they have unrestricted ability to just print money. That the only way you're going to maintain a stable currency and reasonable, predictable values of what a unit of money is worth is when you have a commodity standard such as gold. And Ricardo was a strong proponent of the gold standard, as most of the classical economists were, that the only way you maintain a currency's value and free it from political manipulation is to make the commodity itself the core money, and that any paper money is not money, but merely money substitutes for convenience of daily transactions, with their claims to ultimately the commodity money that is being stored in banks for your other convenient purposes. That meant two things: the case for free trade and the case for sound money. And in fact, Great Britain remained as a free trade country practically for a century. They only went off gold during the First World War because then they wanted to print money for their funding of their war expenses. And they remained a free trade country until the First World War, when again, war resulted in them setting up trade barriers. But from the end of the Napoleonic Wars until the First World War, almost a century, Britain was moving towards and was establishing a sound currency, free trade environment, which then many other countries came to see as succeeding, as generating prosperity, of assuring wide latitude of liberty for the citizens, that resulted in other countries, maybe it's not radically as Great Britain, but copying and emulating it. So that by the 1870s, it is easy to say that these classical achievements of free trade and sound money revolutionized the economic environment of all of the, quote, civilized world, which meant Europe and North America. And that, in fact, by the 1890s, 1892 to be precise, when Austria-Hungary sort of de facto formalized the gold standard, and the Russian Empire de jure, in fact, went on a gold standard, that by the end of the 19th century, all of the major economies were gold-based. Maybe governments cheated periodically, but the principle was a gold-backed currency to prevent monetary mischief. And that certainly by the 1870s and 1880s, all of the major countries had maybe not as free trade as Great Britain, but certainly in Europe, much freer trade in which, for all intents and purposes, goods flowed across borders and between countries relatively easy with, by today's standards, and certainly the standards in the early decades of the 20th century during the 1920s and 30s and 40s, minimal restrictions on the movement of goods. It was an era of free trade and sound money, broadly speaking, and due to the ideas of the classical economists. Now, there's more to the classical economists than just that, but those are two important things: freeing trade from the heavy hand of government control and limiting the ability of the government to just print money.
Okay, well then that period of 1870 then leads us up to Karl Menger and the Austrian Revolution, the Austrian School of Economic Thought. So do you want to just wrap up then this two-part series, or do you feel it's necessary to go into John Stuart Mill?
No. We in fact have to talk about, it would be legitimate and worthwhile to talk about a variety of other things of the classical economists. For example, Jean-Baptiste Say and Say's law. The argument, not just for free trade, but the classical argument against government intervention in general. And while, just to sort of give a tease of that, while John often considered the great compromiser, the justifier of socialism and redistribution, if you really read Mill carefully, whatever slippages he makes, and they are grievous in places, he basically says that given human nature, and particularly the nature of governments and politicians, you have to be leery of ever allowing government to do practically anything. And I think it would be worthwhile talking a little bit about that as well.
Okay, sounds good. Then we'll wrap things up on that note, and we'll go to part 3 next week of the Classical Economist. And greatly enjoyed the conversation as always, Richard. Remember, just want to invite everybody to attend our Thursday night session with Joe Salerno, one of our Austrian stars, that goes back to that really big watershed conference that Richard talked about, that I'm sure he's going to talk about in his final talk. And if you're new to FFF, subscribe to our FFF Daily and our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. And Richard, again, I greatly enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to talking with you about part 3 of the Classical Economist next week.
Until next time.